John Ward so special at what he did?
You know, John was gifted. John had, he got his law degree when he was here. He never practiced law, but that taught him how to use the language, taught him how to organize, taught him how to be prepared. And John just had that gift. He wasn't a yeller and a screamer, but he had the great control of his voice and his emotions that he was able to, through his marketing ability, I think, able to capture the moment without using a lot of words, but the perfect words, and that's what made him so special. I mean, you look at all the great calls he made, you know, he wasn't yelling and screaming or using, just very succinct and precise and accurate, and that's what his big, I think his big calling card was. He wanted to be accurate, wanted to be a reporter, but also he had that colorful flair which made him stand out and be unique.
What were some of your favorite calls of his?
Well, I was, my favorite game, of course, I had the pleasure for 15 years of spotting for him. So I got a chance to sit next to him for 15 years. While I met him when I was in college here, worked as a film editor on the Bill Battle Show. And then shortly after I graduated, I was working at WIBK, and he hired me as his spotter. So I was able to sit there through all those big moments. But I think the Sugar Bowl game in '85 was his best game because he was on top of it. Nobody expected Tennessee to win that game. It had been all week. We took over New Orleans, all the Tennessee fans, and he hit every single call that night. The Jeff Powell run, the touchdown pass in the end zone. I mean, it was just, he was perfect that night. I think that was his best overall game.
As a spotter working behind the scenes with him, what were the interactions like? Were you tapping, into his knowledge, or was he intimidating? Talk about that.
He was at times tough to work for because he was such a perfectionist, and you didn't do much talking in the booth. He did all the talking, and he would always tell you, if it was a big game, I don't need you excited, I don't need you psyched up, I need you prepared. And that was his deal. He would have a clipboard, and he would have 30 to 40 pages of notes that he typed, and he'd have it on his clipboard, and he'd occasionally thumb through it during the game, but I think he had most of it memorized. He might only use 20 or 30% of it, but that just tells you how much preparation he did. And he always told me if he ever got to the point where he didn't want to do the preparation, he'd quit doing the games, because he thought, and I think that's from his law background, that you needed to be prepared. So he had kind of attacked every game as if he was getting ready to go into a courtroom and had to make his case, and I think that really worked for him.
What was he like just as a personality, just as a guy away from the booth?
He was totally different away from the booth. I mean, had a great sense of humor. He was always kind of pulling pranks, but he was a quiet guy. I mean, if he would come into a room, he'd stand in the corner. He never wanted the spotlight on him. I think one of his good traits was he was so good with people. He would go to the games, like all the basketball games, and any place he went, he'd have a satchel with 8x10 pictures of himself, which you would think would be kind of egotistical. But what he did it for is if there was a kid that came up with just a scrap of paper or just something, you ripped, a napkin or something, that he wanted his autograph, and John was, well, we can do better than that. And he would give him a souvenir that the young person would take with him. And those things lasted. I mean, you still hear people all the time talk about what a great moment that was for him to be able to get this picture of John Ward, and a lot of them still have them hanging up in their rooms or their offices. So he just understood, and I think it's from his advertising and his marketing background. He understood people, and he understood about marketing and packaging the product. And again, I think that was one of his big gifts too from his advertising. Because advertising is where he made his money. He did broadcasting as a hobby, but he knew how to package the broadcast. He knew how to sell the broadcast. He understood what Tennessee fans wanted, and he gave it to them. And pretty simple formula.
He worked in an era where not every game was on TV,
Yeah.
and you really had to paint a picture because
Right.
not everyone could see it. He had the ability to do that.
Oh, I think he grew up in a time, I mean, when everybody now is growing up watching games on TV, and you kind of, that's how but back when he grew up, he listened to the games on the radio with Bill Stern and all those great legendary broadcasters. And so that's where he kind of learned and painted the picture. And you go back in that golden age when John started, none of the games were on television. And so people would have this great connection with John because they would sit there and there'd be you'd hear from farmers out in Middle Tennessee. They're riding their tractors listening to John, or people that are out on picnics, or people sitting around their living room, or on those cold winter nights when they're listening to Ernie and Bernie. The games weren't on television, and so they'd sit there and listen to John. And John just understood that you needed to paint that picture, and he really did. He was very gifted in understanding how to package the game and how to paint that picture, and I think that came from his marketing. And the other thing, he was incredibly smart too, so he understood all that.
Bob, he's known for so much of his football calls and his time calling for Tennessee football, but he was really good at basketball as well, and maybe under discussed. Can you talk about him as a basketball broadcaster?
Some people will tell you he was better at basketball than he was football. I think he loved basketball more. He loved the Ray Mears era. I mean, he loved Billy Justice winning that first SEC championship to get him to the NCAA tournament. He talked about that all the time when they won down at Mississippi State. Now, that's where he got the towel, because at the end of the game, one of the window panes in the old Mississippi State field house was broken, so there was a draft coming through, and he was losing his voice at the end of the game. So he got that towel from one of the managers and wrapped it around his neck, and of course Tennessee won. And so he was superstitious, so he always wore the towel around his neck for the rest of his broadcasting career. So he was superstitious about a lot of stuff. And if we were on road trips, and the year before, if we lost and we ate at some restaurant, we had to eat at another restaurant. I mean, he's all that type of stuff. So I just enjoyed being around him. He was really a lot of fun.
When was the last time you spoke with him?
Probably about 3 weeks ago, I went to see him, and it was interesting. There was a young man. We used to have a broadcasting camp here, and John would be nice enough to come over and talk. And there was a young man by the name of Neil Price out of Morristown. And Neil came to the camp, and he was eating up with us. And when John spoke, he wrote down all his notes, and he just kept all that. And last year, Neil was named as the play-by-play voice at Mississippi State. And he credits John, because he grew up listening to John, but credits John for playing such a big role and coming to the broadcasting camp and being able to interact with him. And so a couple of weeks, Neil was in town, so Neil and I went over to see him, and he told the story to John about, and thanked him for what an impact he made. And so, it was really a special day. But, John was always so proud of guys that worked underneath him, like Mike Keith and other guys that went on to have success in the business. He took a lot of pride in that, and I think he really took pride in the Ball Network and guys that came along that were able to reach some success, and he played such a large part in all of that.
What's the biggest thing you think you learned from him?
Being prepared, and I think being the fact that you're not the show. The game is the show, and it's not about you, it's about getting it right. One thing John did, when all the games started to go on television, John would not allow us, this is when I was spotting for him, would not allow us to turn on the TVs in the booth, because he said, we're radio guys. Our job is to get it right the first time. And he said, I don't want you watching TV, I want you concentrating on the game. And so that put a lot more pressure on you, because you didn't have it. You couldn't make a mistake. You had to get it right, and that was his philosophy. You just needed to get it right.
Did he do that through the end of his career?
The last time I spotted for him was in '92. That's when I left to go to Jefferson Pilot. But up until that time, there were no TVs in the booth. It was all concentrate, and I need you to concentrate on the game. So.
You mentioned he could be hard on you guys. What was it like? Like, if you got something wrong, how would he react?
Well, most time he would allow you to get it wrong once, and he hated careless mistakes. I mean, if you made mistakes because you weren't prepared or you just weren't paying attention, there weren't many chances he would let you do it a second time. He would also write out about a 3-page critique, type it out, and we would get it we'd come by his office on Monday morning, and he'd have a 3-page critique of the broadcast, and he would go through all of it. And the person he was hardest on was himself. And he would say, I should have done this better, I didn't do this, but then he'd also go, Kesling, you need to pay attention to this, you need to, and he'd go right from the engineer, all right down, the guy that cleaned the booth. I mean, he went right down the list. And I still got some of those, and I go back and look at them every once in a while and just think, he kept you on your toes. I mean, he made sure that you were thinking about what you were doing and you weren't daydreaming. And if you did, then you didn't come back.
People who might live outside the southeast, outside of